So I'm not even going to start Job Schneider's trick and saying how fantastic language you have in Denmark, all that stuff, because you know no Swede will say that to you, right? But congratulations that you are the digital, mecca of, well, that's also not a good word, I guess, the heaven of digital, and I can see that all the cloud industry has found a spot in Denmark, so, thanks a bunch. So I guess we're just going to have snow in Sweden and misery, so thanks for that. All right. Before I start, this is usually, well, I feel welcome here because most of the people here, inside out are routing and everything, right? So if there are very obscure, very hard question, I actually have one of our better guys here, he's actually Danish. So Klaus, can you just wave hand there? So that's the guy you're going to ask questions. Because I will ask him question, right? This is like reroute thing, right? The shit goes downhill, you know that. If anything, just wave your hand or shout or whatever. I'm used to that. People don't listen to me. But if you're saying ugly Danish words, I've been married to a Danish woman for 31 years. So you ska holy chef. So that's it. All right. Oh, Jesus Christ. So how many in here, knows the concept of Flowspec? Please raise a hand. So, oh, Jesus Christ. Why do you want me to talk then? All right. All right. How many here has implemented Flowspec? Please raise a hand. Now it's getting better. Okay. How can you guys implement? You're on my gear, and now we implemented it, right? All right. Fair enough. My name is Peter Lundqvist. I'm 5 years in Arista. Before that, I was 14 years in Juniper, including development. So I've been wasting a fair amount of my life trying to implement, create this bullshit, right? So, I know how it is. All right, Flowspec. It's been around for some time. It's no news, really. It has been written endless papers about it, which doesn't make sense, really. This is one of those scenarios that come up from time to time. Is there anyone in here as an operator that would trust, in mind all this routing security that we heard about, that would accept a Flowspec update from your customer, including an access list that will actually drop traffic? Please raise a hand. So I don't need to go into this, right? Because this is just plain bullshit. And this is the first thing you can see on an implementation about vendors. If they have any papers like that, choose another vendor. That's it. Because they don't know what they're talking about. That's it. So this is the realistic scenario of Flowspec. That means that most of the critical keys for Flowspec actually happens before you're going to advertise them. That is, you're going to discover that you have an event, right? Which means that you're going to have DDoS or whatever coming in from a peer on a certain interface. They just not come into your whole network, right? They come in from a certain peer or peers. So there is where you want to communicate. That's where you're going to install rules. So there is when you're going to do some actions. So if anyone says it differently, I wish them good luck, but that's not how Flowspec works. Because if you would have like a database approach to it, install it in a table, in mind then, how can you secure that all your gear can support the same number of rules? You will find out that there can be routers as the size of your refrigerator that maybe can have 50 rules. And there are other gear that the size of a shoe that can have 20,000. So you will be forced to be very complicated scheme with, let's say, communities to filter out. These are high-capacity Flowspec routers, and they are good Flowspec, and so on. No, so the appropriate design is, of course, is that you have a controller way of handling it. The controller could be helped by a router, of course, but that's the one that's going to communicate with your peering and install those rules. That's a fundamental design aspect. So if you don't listen to anything else in my presentation, focus on that if you haven't started your Flowspec implementation, because this is what works. So a little bit of theory. 2007, people start about it. This is the second time I've been implementing Flowspec. I did it with Peter Marquez in Juniper around 2009. It was hot and heavy at that time, and then nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. And by the way, RPKA also was at that time, but no one cares about it. And then until a few years ago, simply I couldn't sell a PN router unless it has support of Flowspec. So Flowspec, in its brief, it installs actions, and actions is in a community. I will come to that. SAFI, of course, we have to have that. So it's 133. If it's an MPLS involved, it's 134. So if you have number 1, well, then you deal with IPv4 rules. And if you have RFE2, well, guess what? Then you deal with IPv6 rules. Then it's actually minor differences. It's not just that. A proper implementation needs to have a lot more, like route refresh, multi-protocol, 4-byte AES, and most of the time also add path, because you want to deal with the controller that can advertise things, needs to know the whole world, not after you've done the route path selection. So that's it, not more complicated than that. What's also pretty keen here is that when you see in a Flowspec update, there's a piece there that sort of is very similar to what you have seen before, the multi-protocol piece, where there's a route, right? But all the actions are in communities. So if you're talking to someone in a support center or a developer, when you talk about actions, they don't understand what you're talking about. Talk about extended community things, then they understand what you want to achieve. These are IPv4 rules. This is probably one of the most common questions you can see in RFPs if you are from a vendor like me. You know, as you can see, I have my shirt here, all that stuff. That's my hidden message here. You know, I have to make my living also. So the only difference between V6 and V4 regards to rules is that type 3 will be next header, and then obviously type 13, the flow header version makes sense. Elsewhere, the types are identical. Now come to the magic, and this is the things that I usually spend most of my time on when people ask me about Flowspec, because it's an understandable fact that Flowspec are seen as distributing access list, but it's not, right? It's distributing a regular expression. So a Flowspec rule can handle a lot of stuff regards to a route, and that's the big difference from a static manual access list. And that you will see if you're doing a little bit of overworking, you will see that the most common question that vendors get is that how many rules do you support? The sneaky and easy answer, well, the same number of access lists. But that's not the case, right? Because a rule can be by far bigger, can eat up more chunks in TCAM space just because you can also do these regular expression. So this one is not particularly complicated, right? You know, this is one you could achieve in an access list, right? This is a little bit more complicated because here you say I need to have that port and that port, but not that port in that range. So, and they're here only play in the destination port, right? And you can do this more or less in all fields of those types. You can play around and do advanced filters. And these are the result where you can see that in one test, you can see that you can support 20,000 rules. And then the next test, oh, I only have going to be 2,000 before my memory chunk out. And that is because you have been a little bit too overproductive here in the regular expressions. Some CLI example, you know, they're using in my firm the sort of, I can't use, you know, that particular word. We say the industrial standard language. So you open up a protocol family, that's it. And at least in our implementation, you have to pick those interfaces that you're going to install a rule. And that is sort of the heart and soul of most of these implementation that works, is that you don't just install them blindly in the fib, you install it to a pointer to an interface. That's how you can scale. So I think it's fair design limitation because you know what was your border interfaces, right? Or potential border interfaces. So if you're a large operator, of course, it doesn't need to be your private peering or your peering and exchange point. It can also be the peering towards your customer. But it's sort of, you know, you're going from ingress to egress. Then, how many inside here are seeing themselves as BGP experts? Please raise a hand. Okay, how many people know about BGP in here? All right, so we are all experts then. So it's the same thing. So you have an adjacency bin. You can absolutely see what gets advertised to you. No difference. And guess what? There's a rib also, right? So that is happened after you've done your path selection. So it's still BGP under the hood here, right? So there will be a path selection regards BGP, whatever complicated, funky rule you do, please remember this is BGP. And in the end, there's a fib. And in our implementation, and most implementation, there's something that I can install similar to an access list in the TCAM space. So that is sort of the fib. So this is the conceptual thing, even from a development point of view, that you follow exactly the same thing that you have been doing for years and ever with your BGP routers. Counters, it's a delegate thing, depending on implementation. Some implementation supports Flowspec rules on those interfaces that you also can have static access list. Others don't. And some of them you have to choose who you're going to supply the counters or not. But in most implementation, these work side by side. Then it comes to the point who you're going to trust. Well, I don't know what type of access you're going to put on your border routers, but they will be probably more related to protocols. Meantime, Flowspec Rule is going to be specific to the threat that you're going to fight against. I think that's a fair assessment, but probably someone will take me to school one day, like my teacher did, successfully many years ago. Then it's a very much dependent type the hardware have. The implementation that Arista have using very much the Jericho hardware, and there are no free lunches, believe me. This is just some CLI ads that we're changing in order to because what this is here is actually SDK toolkits in a nice manner, because we hacked so much in the drivers to be able to accomplish this. So when people saying that, for instance, that Flowspec doesn't work on Jericho, that's just bullshit. Well, it means that they can't program the Jericho hardware, or they haven't paid Broadcom enough to do it on their behalf. That's it. It's a wonderful piece of program. It's complicated, but like everything in life, there's no free lunch. Flowspec actions. Again, this is a community. The standards is very flaky here. If the standards is crystal clear how you're going to handle a route and how many types you're going to support, regards to standards, what type of action is really flaky, and it is really up to the implementation. But a decent implementation at least have drops, of course. You should have redirects to a VRF or redirects to a next hop. That's it. Then there are some other things like if you are a transit operator, you actually make money on DDoS also, right? That means that maybe you want to change the distro code point on them and stuff like that, but you don't want to drop. So again, this is a little bit up to implementation goes to action. So, by saying answer an RFP or something like that from you guys, they say, yeah, we support Flowspec, you have to check what type of actions are supported. That is actually a better question than asking how many types do you support, because you have to support the types in order to be a Flowspec ones. Drop rule, very easy. It will install, in this case, it says 0. 0 means everything, but of course you can have a shaper that you say, I don't know, shape it down to 1 meg or 1 gig or whatever. It can be on any type of rule set on top, right? You're dropping traffic. So I would say this is probably one of the more common rules because this is distinguished from a design when you have Onramp&Offramp that you put all traffic to a certain site and there you're going to kill it. Flowspec's whole idea is going to kill it where it enters once you have decided it's going to be a threat. Redirect. It may be seen for you guys as easy, but there are actually two conflicting drafts. What is the next hop? My biggest contribution to development is I say we're going to spend 1 minute on that and support both. Because elsewhere you can, I remember in the Unix implementation, we spent 5 weeks to understand which one actually will count. And that's just useless amount of time. And the difference between them is minor. VRF. How many here runs the concept of on-ramp-off-ramp with using preferably Arbor? 1 person. Man. Usually they are better in selling their expensive gear than that, actually. OK. I would say that 3 rules are the most common ones, right? Obviously drop and redirect to a VRF where the VRF is an MPLS network. And then they're going to pull the whole thing to a site where you have the mitigation device. They're going to decide to kill it or not. So these are the major 3 tasks, I would say, that are the most common ones for Flowspec. Some gotchas, and this is actually where I'm going to spend most of my time on, and here is sort of experience from someone that has failed a couple of times here. I can't say that I'm failing now because I get my salary from Arista, so now we are perfect, of course. There are some big difference between an access list and a rule, right? An access is pretty easy, right? Because you have a segment, right? You have an ID. So it's pretty easy to see that first you have installation 1, and then you have installation 2, and then installation 3, and so forth, right? So it's pretty hard to fail on an aggregate visit none in an installation rule. There's no such thing in Flowspec. Flowspec treats all rules in a sort of a database manner, right? So you have to be really keen if you are killing something more specific. At the same time, you have an aggregate, you will see that they can coexist and work, both of them, right? So there's no concept of that I install this rule first, and then 10 seconds later I install another rule. You know, don't think in that way. The rules that you installed in Flowspec, those are the ones that are going to make individual actions independently when you install them. So everything that is active in your TCAM, they will do the job. So there's no such thing as sequence 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And further on, that means also that if you clear your BGP session, guess what happens? You take away all those rules, right? So there's a certain piece of maintenance and keep and feed here when you're running Flowspec, which is, you know, vendors like me and Kireti, we really don't care, right? We had 3 nodes in a lab, and then we, you know, play around. You will have 100 nodes, right? So pay attention to them. Even Mr. Schneider needs to do that. Second one is that we look at here at an example. So I'm using just XBGP to try to visualize it. So first, I'm going to install a very aggregated rule. I'm just looking at the source address. Then I don't care about the destination. Fine. Work like a charm. It gets installed in the RIB, and it gets installed in the FIB, and I have counted packets. Safe and sound. Now I'm going to install the next one, which means I'm going to install a more specific rule. Because that's one of my experiences that I've thought when you have multiple controllers, they were exactly identical. But they are not. Usually one controller using one toolkit, if it's PMAC or whatever, to make its judgment. And then you have another controller that is based on, I don't know, a standalone firewall or whatever, intrusion detection system that maybe can do a little more granular tuning. So they're working on the same amount of S-flow information, whatever you feeds to it, individual decision. So if that then is going to rule and install a rule that are more specific, you're going to have 2 installation rules because they are different, right? One is just looking at the source, and one's looking at the source and destination. Nice extra Qumran thing there that happened on the thing. But yeah, that's commercial for ASIC. That's good. We like that. You like that, Kireti, Qumran? I can take you there anyway, right? You know, I have them lots of them in my lab, not to Israel, by the way. What's happened here in most of the implementation and most of all in ours is that then the counting is for where you hit, right? So if the earlier one were counted on an aggregated matters, now you have a more specific rule installed. Those are the ones that are going to go counting. But any proper implementation that uses telemetry and so forth still have your original data. So don't you worry, you know, that is safe and sound and stored somewhere. But in the delta phase of it, it's the active hits that you can see all the counting. But again, these are 2 installed entries, and there's valid reason for it. Maybe the first one is not that practical, right? But it is different from the first one, and thereby is active. Path selection. Hopefully I don't need to go into that, but usually the people that drive, the drivers in the operators that runs the Flowspec, they actually have somewhat knowledge about BGP. There are a few of you, hopefully, that will have the exclusive thing of both being a security expert and routing jockey, fine, then this is self-explainable to you. But you will see there are many people here that really don't know about path selection. So let's say that you're installing a rule here from one of the nodes, that's your primary rule. Without knowing it, and without knowing that at least router ID is the last in the chimney, regards to the path selection, guess what? This is independent, this is Flowspec, it is still BGP. That means that the BGP rules will apply independently of what type of rules you have. So in this case, that you have a rule, which is very common, that you start with a rule that's going to do redirect, and then after some time, you want that rule to change to do drop, coming from another controller, That will not win if the BGP path-selection thinks that the first one is better because, it has a lower router ID or whatever. So please pay attention to that. Errors. We spend a lot of time on that in EOS engineering. And that is, we're following the RFCs here, which means that errors are really handling in the last piece of the installation phase. And I will try to show you, So now let's try to install a very funky thing here, right? The destination ports needs to be 80 within a range 80 to 888. I mean, this is a really clear false rule, right? But on the RIB phase, the evaluation there is only based on the BGP attributes and the routes related to the rule. Has nothing to do if the rule makes sense or not. And that is how the RFC is drafted. So if you do differently here, well, maybe that 10 minutes. Don't you worry. They just look into my glorious charm anyway, not what I'm saying. So that means that in order to drop this stuff, it will be the last thing once you're going to install it in the fib. We had it doesn't necessary that I comply that this is the perfect way of doing it, but this is the draft. So if you're going to change that behavior, well, I mean, someone needs to change the draft, like, I don't know, Job or Kiretti or my mom or someone, I don't know. All right, last piece here is the TCAM. And again, I briefly touched to it. So this is one of the most common questions I get. So how many rules can you install? And this is really hardware dependent and the type of rule that you're going to install. So in my example here, I'm going to install it on a Jericho device. This is a fairly simple rule. It just looks at a source prefix, right? So it's going to take up one position in my TCAM space. So Jericho device that has proper SDK handle roughly 24K of access list, which is somewhat the same that you can install with Flowspec Rule, if that rule follows sort of an access list way of doing it. But if you are productive here, again, and using those features that Flowspec are good for with regular expressions, this line here is actually 2 entries. Because if you would try to configure this in a regular access list, that will actually be 2 access lists, right? Then it will be 2 positions. So depending on the test that you are doing, sometimes you can support 24,000 access lists, or sometimes you can do 2,000. So if you are asking someone, a vendor, say, how many rules do you support? And they say 20K, absolutely. They don't know shit what they're talking about. So then I don't know who's the error here. You trusting them or they saying it? So all is based on the rules that you're going to install. Right. That's all. Questions? When are we going to support RPKA? Or I think we deal with that 3 hours in a bar yesterday, me and Mr. Schneider's actually. So he sort of banged it into my head. So.
Good job. No questions? Nope.
Oh, no.
No, I'm just wondering, we sort of figured that. My name is Alan, I work for Telia. We cleared away the whole towards your customer thing in the beginning. But I was just wondering if there's any plans of trying to do some filtering that could make it applicable towards customers in the future.
What do you mean, predefined filters or?
No, I mean, if you're going to allow your customers to inject rules that are basically firewall rules into your core, you
right.
obviously want some filtering of that so they don't null route stuff that you're not supposed to null route or take too many resources or whatever you want to filter around.
So some checking. It's perfectly doable. It's perfectly doable. And that's most likely that will happen. Because well, maybe I shouldn't talk that much now. I'm in sales, right? But I have a bad background in engineering. That is that a TCAM doesn't feel good. It has trash into it, like you in a hard disk actually, and they are not that much different, right? So avoiding having crap on the TCAM space, that is good. It's like if you are fat and you want to be small, what's the best advice to be small? Well, be small to begin with, right? Don't be fat, right? So this is the same. This is the same behavior that you should apply on TCAM actually, because it's pretty hard to clear a TCAM space. A route table is a chunk of memory. It's pretty hard to clear, and you can say, yeah, I want to clear that piece. That works. I know it. Mr. Dr. Kireti Kompella. By the way, I wasted too many years on implementing your stuff, right? So we have a happy separation these days.
I thought we covered that yesterday.
Oh, yeah. But that was after drinking 10 beers with Mr. Schneiders.
Thanks, Joe. That helped a lot. The question I have is, how far down the path of doing semantic checks of the Flowspec rules do you want to go? Like the example you gave, yeah, it's an easy one to kind of say, can't be ATN in that range at the same time. But you can start getting very far down into those rules. And do you want to filter those rules out? I mean, do you want to say these are not acceptable? And if so, at what level? Because BGP is not doing that.
So, I mean, that, you know, I've been around too much. I can answer with a question, right? So, but I'm not going to walk that way. What I'm saying here is that most of the larger implementations these days, and that is the tier 1s and the tier 2s, they don't start with killing something, right? Because it doesn't matter how much our code we put into this stuff. These are not the smartest. They are not stateful inspection devices, right? If you're going to do stateful inspection devices, you need to have a special line card, and then you have to convince the customer to buy it. You know, we've been trying that, both you and me. But I think the better piece is that you'd redirect, based on statistic, to appropriate devices. The firewall industry had done this for years, and there are some sure that are excellent, like PMACT. Let them do the worst piece of the investigation here, and based on that, then you can install a rule. Then it's a little bit how you focus. I think it's the wrong path in the industry if we're going to try to learn and look into really beyond into the headers on a router level, because that will consume a lot of space, right? A lot of instructions, right? To begin with, that will kill all hardware that has a pipeline construction. It needs to have a radix tree hardware sort of, because you need to go back and forward to it. So again, I think it's better that work conjunctionally with the security space, let them find out what is something, because then they can find out appropriate thing. If that is just based on source or destination IP, kill it. It's easy as that, right? Because I let many people say to me, right, oh, yeah, I have my network is based on, I have a lot of caches and load balancing, right? And they use them VIP address, right? So it's the same address in the whole data centers that we hitch to. But guess what? The traffic that comes to it will be 99% of cases different source address. So it's not that hard really to put a decent filter to it. So if I should choose a design, well, Arista have made a design choice, and it's based on much of the things that I've been learning over the years, that is scale is better than to be very, very smart on a few rules. That's my answer.
Any other questions?
I guess I can go up to snowy north now and feel miserable because I live in now the digital kingdom of Denmark. It's absolutely something is not rotting in Denmark, obviously. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Peter.